Well, welcome back to part two of lipid health concerns, basically talking about cardiovascular disease. And so in this section, what we're going to do is talk a little bit more about nutrition therapy. Last section, we spent our time looking at the primary target for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, and that was lowering LDL cholesterol. So we took a pretty in-depth look at why LDL is an issue and talked a lot about oxidized LDLs and that kind of thing. But if a patient comes in and their primary target, LDL cholesterol, is not an issue, it meets the guidelines, then the secondary target that a person would want to look at is the metabolic syndrome. So we've talked about metabolic syndrome and introduced that, but we're looking at reducing total cholesterol, the HDL, triglycerides, and then the LDLs that we talked about last time, and blood pressure. So we'll address blood pressure when we get to the hypertension section. But what I want to look at in this section is the nutrition therapy piece. So what things in food could raise the LDLs or affect the HDLs. And therefore, as you know, the total cholesterol is going to be an accumulation of all the VLDLs, the LDLs, and HDLs, and they basically burst those and just collect all the total cholesterol. So we're going to be looking at specifically what foods and what things could raise or lower LDLs and what could raise or lower HDLs in this section. So I wanted to start with long-chain saturated and trans fatty acids. These are considered the highest risk factor for raising LDLs because they are going to impair the receptor pathway. So we talked about the receptor pathway. Basically, we refer to it as the liver receptor pathway. That is going to remove LDLs from the blood. So what you're seeing is that the long chain and trans fatty acids are going to affect that pathway, and I'll show you how. And then they're going to increase the risk of the scavenger pathway by increasing the blood level concentration. So there is a group out there that would like to have the standard for saturated fats be reduced to 7%. So SFA is saturated fatty acids, and these are basically the long chained to about 7%. Now you remember in your diet study we're sticking with 10% because that's pretty much the goal right now. But it could be lowered in the future, but looking mainly at the long chained. And then the trans fat is less than 1%, but it's hard to gauge how much trans fat we're getting because, as you remember in our labeling, they can label trans fats less or zero if it's less than 0.5 grams. So anyway, we're not really sure how to gauge the less than 1%, but that would be the goal for that. If you remember from our discussion last time, we looked at the individual liver cell and we looked at how the liver cell would monitor the LDLs in the blood. If the LDLs were too high, then it's going to add receptors to its membrane. It's going to bring in the LDLs and then go through the process of deesterifying them and converting them into free cholesterol. And at a certain point, then the liver cell is going to be full of free cholesterol, and it is then going to have an oversupply, which would reduce and inhibit the HMG-CoA reductase, so the liver won't make any more of its own free cholesterol. It's going to inhibit the ability to go through transcription translation and make plasma membrane receptors, and then it's going to activate the ACAT pathway and reesterify the free cholesterol and store it, so that we're, in an effort to try to reduce the amount of free cholesterol. Um, so what we talked about was that at a certain point, the liver cell will get full of free cholesterol, and then it will no longer take in the blood LDLs. Well, what they have found is that long-chain saturated fatty acids, so again, these are fatty acids that are, between 12 and 18 normally, and they're saturated. And the 14 to 16 chain length seems to be the one that affects the pathway the most. And what it's going to affect is the ACAT pathway. So the result is that the free cholesterol will not be esterified into storage form. And so the free cholesterol will not be reduced. Therefore, you're going to have an oversupply of free cholesterol, and you're going to inhibit the pathway that makes LDL receptors. And actually, the LDL receptors will be taken away from the plasma membrane, and you will not take any more LDLs into the liver cell. So therefore, the LDLs are going to stay high in the blood. So a common misconception is that saturated fats are going to raise the LDL by causing your body to make more, or it's going to increase your cholesterol by causing your body somehow to make more cholesterol and put it into the blood, and that's not true. The recent research is showing that it's just not allowing the liver cell to do its job. It's not allowing the liver cell to take out LDLs. And so they stay high in the blood. And trans fats will do the same thing. So what I want you to remember is long-chain saturated fatty acids and trans fats are going to reduce the ability of the liver cell to activate the ACAT pathway, which is then going to result in high free cholesterol and a reduction of LDL receptors on the plasma membrane. Therefore, the LDLs in the blood are going to stay high, and you increase that risk that they will be oxidized and go what we call the scavenger pathway last. So as you can see from this picture, these are the foods that are high in saturated fats. As you can see, most of them are animal fats. The only other exception would be the tropical oils. But the tropical oils, if you remember, especially coconut, are medium chained, so they're not long chained. So that's why there's not as much concern with coconut oil, even though it is saturated. But mainly animal products are going to be high in saturated fatty acids, and the trans fats are pretty much, as you can see, processed foods, because if you remember, trans fats are man-made, and they will be put into processed foods because they're pretty cheap to make, and they can make them the consistency, they can hydrogenate them to the consistency they want, and they can be used very readily. They are plant foods, so you don't have to use saturated fats to be solid. So a lot of processed foods, margarines are high in trans fats. So butter's high in long chain saturated because milk, dairy is around 14 to 16 carbon lengths. And so, dairy products, or butter has high in saturated, margarine is high in trans, so the goal is basically not to eat as much of any of those. I think the common mantra is, though, if you had to make a choice, you would choose butter because it's a little bit more natural and your body really is not used to trans fats. But if you can reduce both of them, that would be really the best answer to that. The monounsaturated fats are considered heart friendly. So they don't have any effect on the receptors or wouldn't increase the scavenger pathway. They only have one double bond, and so they have a lower risk of oxidation. And there is some talk about raising the level of recommendation for monounsats up to maybe 15% or more. Remember, we were going to lower the saturated to 7% or less, and maybe raise the recommendation for mono up to 15 or so, because of their heart friendly. Now, there's still 9 calories per gram, so you can't overeat monounsaturates because it will increase the risk for obesity, which we talked about is not a good thing with chronic inflammation and all that. So these are the foods, just to remind you, these are the foods that are high in monounsaturates. So that's why olive oil is recommended for cooking, and avocados have a lot of monounsaturates. Canola oil has a lot of monounsaturates, and that. So those would be recommended. Then any of the nuts, mainly the cashews, the almonds, the peanuts, and walnuts, and all of those would be good. And there's a recommendation of having maybe a handful of almonds per day or something. Not a ton of them, but just a handful, a small handful of almonds or walnuts, that kind of thing per day. Omega-3s are considered heart-friendly, again, because they don't affect the LDL receptors, so they're not going to affect the ACAT pathway. Uh, they are actually blood thinners, and I think I may have mentioned that before, but if you're on Coumadin or some blood thinner, you would not want to take a supplement of omega-3 because they're going to thin your blood even more. So there is a recommendation to be concerned with that, but they do reduce blood clotting effects. They do reduce the risk of oxidation, so they have a positive benefit on oxidation. They are considered anti-inflammatory, so we talked about inflammation with chronic inflammation. So they are considered heart-friendly. They are considered good fats. And so their recommendation, again, 1 to 2% of kilocalories. We talked a little bit more about supplements when we were talking about omega-3s, but just make sure that you check the label on if you're taking fish oil supplements. Make sure you're getting enough of the DHA and EPA. At least between the two of them, 1 gram or 1,000 milligrams per day. Or eat fatty fish, and we talked about what fatty fish were a little bit earlier. Omega-6s are not considered heart-friendly. You don't see the little heart label on omega-6s. It has nothing to do with their effect on the LDL receptors. But they do increase inflammation. They increase the production of what are called prostaglandins. They increase chronic inflammation they're basically considered pro-inflammatory. Therefore, they're going to increase the scavenger activity because of their increase in inflammation. They do increase blood clotting. And because they have multiple double bonds, they have an increased risk of oxidation. So omega-6s are not considered heart-friendly. They are not recommended. The problem is we're eating a lot of omega-6s, as you can see under the goals. At present, depending on who you are and where you live, we can get a ratio of 10 to 50 to 1, and our goal is to be at a 2 to 1 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3. Okay, so we've got to do something to reduce our omega-6s. We're just eating a lot of those. They tend to be the cheaper oils, compared to omega-6, and maybe easier to get. But we're just eating too much of them in this country, and that is increasing our risk for heart disease. Just to talk a little bit about prostaglandins. Prostaglandins, as you can read, basically has an effect on inflammation, but there are different kinds of prostaglandins. So I'll show you a little chart here in a sec. Uh, but the ones from omega-6, the arachidonic acids from omega-6, are not, they are basically pro-inflammatory. So these are not good prostaglandins. So as you can see from this chart on the left, you see the omega-6s, which are linoleic, and you go through these conversion steps. You know, you convert to arachidonic acid, but then that is converted into pro-inflammatory signals that you know, the prostaglandins PG2 is considered pro-inflammatory. You look at the omega-3s though, and they converted down to EPA, and you notice that they're anti-inflammatory. So we need to increase those omega-3s and reduce our omega-6s. So here you can see, you know, one content level of omega-3 versus omega-6s. So again, we talked about it before, is that we need to reduce our intake of using safflower, corn, cottonseed oils, those kind of sesame oil. You have to watch that one. Soybean, I mean, but you notice that soybean, canola, they do have some omega-3s. You notice up the top of safflower and corn, they have 0 omega-3s. So that's why, you know, if you don't use olive oil, a good choice would be canola because it's high in mono compared to other plants, but it also has some omega-3s. It's not a 2-to-1 ratio, but it's better than using corn oil or something like that. But if you can use olive oil, that's kind of the oil of choice. But you notice that flaxseed has a lot of omega-3. There is a conversion step, as you remember, and so you don't get all of it that you could. And then fish would be the ultimate because you're actually eating the DHA and EPAs in fish. So reduce those corn oils. You know, if you have those in your shelf, get rid of them if you can, and start using olive oil or canola oil is the recommendation to you know, use for cooking and stuff like that. Beware though, the smart balance. I got this out of a nutrition journal, but what basically it says supports healthy cholesterol levels, but underneath, and it's hard to read, I see that, but it says already in the normal range. So it's going to support healthy cholesterol if it's already in the normal range. If your cholesterol is not in the normal range, it's not going to help you much. The other thing it says on the very bottom of the container, it says the right blend of fats may improve your cholesterol ratio when at least 2/3 of your intake comes from this product, or a properly balanced diet. So who's going to eat 2/3 of their diet of smart balance is the key. So the bottom line is smart balance isn't the best spread, it just has the best marketing. So, you know, marketers are really smart. So be careful with the small print and kind of check it out. And if you can reduce your butter, if you can reduce your margarine, and use something else, but be careful, because if you say, okay, I'm going to reduce my margarine, I'm going to put peanut butter on there, make sure you check and see that there's no partially hydrogenated fats, because then you're going to get your trans. Okay, the other nutrition therapy goal is to raise our HDLs. Okay, HDLs have quite a bit of positive effects on cardiovascular disease. I mainly want you to remember the top 3 because HDLs are considered good cholesterol. We know them as good lipoproteins, but the 3 are the reverse translocks transport, they're antioxidants, and they're anti-inflammatory. So they're going to do the top three things that are increase the risk of heart disease. Uh, how do you do that? The best way to increase HDLs is aerobic exercise. If you do not exercise and you want to raise your HDLs, the best option is to increase and start doing some aerobic exercise. Now, if you're already doing aerobic exercise, doing more has not been shown to make that much more difference. I remember doing a lipid panel for the Vancouver Park and Rec District, and I worked with a person who did the laboratory tests for cholesterol and stuff. And he was a marathon runner, so he ran 100 miles a week and all that kind of stuff. Um, and if you remember, the levels for HDLs is for men for like 45 or above is considered good, and his was at 42, and he could not get that above 42. But he was in good shape and good health because he was running a lot. So if you already do aerobic exercise, then doing more is not going to help you. But if you do none, the first option would be to do that. Then losing weight is going to help a little bit, stop smoking, and decrease trans fats. But again, if you're doing a lot of aerobic exercise and your HDLs are low, that's basically your genetics. That's who you are. So there's not much you can do. Your goal would be to reduce oxidation, reduce your LDLs, and work on those. And then stop focusing so much on HDLs because you are where you are, and you're in good shape because you're working out a lot. So HDLs will help to get rid of oxidized LDLs. And there's an enzyme called cholesterol ester transfer protein. So if you remember, the cholesterol that is being transported is in the ester form. So it's a cholesterol ester. And it can remove those cholesterol esters from LDLs and actually reduce the amount of cholesterol within the LDLs, and especially we're talking about if they're oxidized would be a key. So you can see from this diagram the reverse cholesterol transport. You notice I labeled CEPT down there in the box, and you can tell that the HDLs are removing the cholesterol esters and the oxidized LDLs, and then it's going to transport it back to the liver for removal. So you can reduce the oxidized LDLs with HDL for that. So that's one of their positive benefits. And you can also follow the arrow from the liver. You'll notice we're going to the into the blood vessels, and you'll notice that we're removing LDLs, the thing with the star in it, we're removing those from plaque. So HDLs are considered good guys. Now the enzyme that's going to also help is peroxidase, and peroxidase is actually going to inhibit oxidation, but it's also going to be involved in removing the LDLs and the oxidized LDLs from plaque. So if you look at this diagram, you notice on the left bottom there, I've got it blocked in red. You'll notice that the oxidized LDLs, number 4, the peroxidase, is basically removing the oxidized LDL so they don't go to the scavenger receptor. And then up in the top right-hand corner, you notice the peroxidase is actually taking in taking away LDLs from the plaque or the foam cell. Now, once the foam cell bursts and forms plaque with the incorporation of the muscle cells and making it hard, then the HDL can't do anything. But if it's in the foam cell stage, it can reduce the amount of LDLs within those foam cells. And so HDLs are considered the good guys, and you want your HDLs as high as possible. The problem is with HDLs with obesity, and we've talked a lot about obesity, but if you read the headlines, which I highlighted in red, we just talked about the idea that HDLs play a role in protecting against oxidative damage. HDL exerts a protective effect, and it correlated with lipid hydroperoxide levels. Remember, we talked about hydroperoxides during oxidation. But HDL from obese patients is less efficient, and it kind of talks about the decrease of the antioxidant effect is diminished in obese patients. So it says protective action against membrane peroxidation in obese patients could contribute to the accelerated cellular oxidative damage in arteriosclerosis and obesity. So it seems that obesity actually reduces the effect of HDLs. So it's another benefit of reducing obesity. One of the other things that comes into play is iron. We've known for many years that red meat has a negative effect on cardiovascular disease, which means it's going to increase the risk. And a lot of people were saying, used to say that it was more likely the saturated fat. But there's a different possibility that's kind of raised its head, and that's the amount of iron, because there's a lot of iron in red meat. Remember, if you read some of the articles or the in the text into quiz on iron, there is two different kinds of iron. There's non-heme iron that you find in plants like spinach and stuff, and then there's heme iron that you would find in red meat, which is the hemoglobin iron. And so if you eat a lot of red meat, especially in men and postmenopausal women. Now, premenopausal women, you need the iron for anemia because of the loss of blood every month and so forth. But postmenopausal women get more and more, in this case, like men, and they don't need the extra iron, and you can get iron overload, and it's considered cardiotoxic. And also iron can be a catalyst for oxidation. So you can have increased oxidation, you can increase inflammation, you can increase the scavenger pathway. All of those things are risk factors. So getting too much iron is considered cardiotoxic, and it's not a good thing. So for men and postmenopausal women, the recommendation would be highly to reduce your red meat, but also no supplements. So if you look at good vitamin mineral supplements that are for men or women over 50, you'll notice that there is no iron as part of the supplement. So they remove the iron from those. The problem with this is, and one of the concerns with baked products like bread and stuff, if you notice and you look at the ingredient statement on bread, they add iron. And they did that for the benefit of women during childbearing years because they need the iron, so it'd be a good way to supplement it. But for men and postmenopausal women, it's not necessarily a good thing to have that iron in your bread. So make sure if you have parents or grandparents that are taking vitamin mineral supplements, and they're over 50, then you need to make sure that their supplement doesn't have iron in it, unless their healthcare provider recommends they take iron. Maybe they're deficient in iron or something, but in most cases, if they're not deficient in iron, it's not recommended to take a supplementation of that. And here's a statement from the British Medical Journal that basically talks about people who eat beef and red meat have a 26% higher mortality. And then they relate it out to the iron in red meat plus the nitrites and nitrates if you use, processed kind of meats. So the iron in red meat seems, as they say, as a likely culprit for increasing risk of heart disease. The trans fat, or the saturated fats in red meat are about 12 carbons. Now they're not considered great because they're saturated, but the worst are the 14 to 16 carbon length fatty acids, and those are in dairy products. So be careful of dairy, but also be careful of red meat, the iron in red meat for that matter. It's not necessarily the saturated, even though the combo, if you have a risk of heart disease, they do recommend, you don't get the 12 carbon fatty acids. But so the combo of the 12 carbon and the iron is not a good one. And so here's just kind of a picture looking at how iron is carried around as part of ferritin. And if you get a high ferritin load, then that is considered cardiotoxic. And then this just kind of reflects the idea that iron can be a catalyst. So as you can see, I've kind of circled the idea of Fe plus 2 goes to Fe plus 3, creates a free radical, and then you get the lipid peroxidation, and you can get, increase the scavenger pathway. So, and that would be, again, if you have excess iron, that turns into a catalyst. So anyway, this is some recommendations on food intake, especially fats, that could increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. So hopefully you'll take those recommendations to heart and you can be more heart friendly in your home. All right, talk to you next time.